Hi, I'm Clarissa Mall, producer and moderator of the Bulletin. Here's a short clip from one of our segments in this week's episode. To hear the whole conversation, visit the link in our show notes or search for The Bulletin on your favorite podcast platform. This week, Mark Zuckerberg announced that his company Meta will no longer provide fact-checking for content on its platforms, Facebook, Instagram, and Threads, instead relegating that task to users who will now be in charge of moderating content. This move follows suit behind Elon Musk's X, formerly Twitter, that uses community notes as its primary way for users to check posts for accuracy. Zuckerberg said that Meta has too long bowed to societal and political pressure to moderate content, with the result being an unwelcome suppression of free speech. This move, he said, is an effort to correct that problem. Chances are you've got at least one social media account, probably more, and you may be wondering how this is going to affect the way that you engage online. Joining us to get behind this headline and really unpack what's going on is Renee DiResta, a professor at Georgetown and former research manager at Stanford Internet Observatory, a program that studied adversarial abuse online. Also here for the conversation is data engineer Frances Haugen, who was the 2021 Facebook whistleblower, exposing the platform's prioritization of profits over public safety. Renee, Frances, welcome to the Bulletin.
Thanks for having me.
So as we begin, Renee, I wonder if you could just take us back for a moment. Facebook, Instagram, these used to be places where you connected with friends and family who lived far away, where you watched cat videos and shared funny memes. When did these platforms develop dark corners where bad actors lurked? And what was the initial response of companies when they learned that these platforms were being used in untoward ways?
Well, every online site and community has bad actors and has from day one. So let's just start with that. It's a question of proliferation and management, right? And to what extent platforms are proactive in removing the bad elements, whatever bad means for the values of that community. What you saw, though, is just to connect it to Facebook directly, was that in 2015, 2016 timeframe, stories began to go viral that were inaccurate. And I mean, actually demonstrably quite fake, not maybe fake, but clearly fake. Things like Pope endorses Donald Trump or Megyn Kelly fired by Fox News, right? These were two that stick out for me because they showed up as trends on my own feed at the time. And I thought that that was kind of remarkable. And it turned out, we learned later, that they were run by Macedonian content farms, meaning by people outside of the US using kind of hot button clickbait to try to make American audiences click to drive them off platform to a website so that they could read the content there and the spammers would monetize it. So Meta had to think about what to do. The sort of great reckoning with what we called at the time fake news happened in 2016, and that's because the platform began to realize that Donald Trump had just been elected, and there was a lot of concern among Democrats, but among the broader Republican world as well, that misleading stories on Facebook were having impact in the real world. This was around the time of a genocide in Myanmar. This was around the time of other news stories that went viral outside of the United States that were very, very troubling to people who were there. Maria Ressa chronicled the rise of the impact of fake news and propaganda in the Philippines. So you began to see the platform take a stronger tack to try to minimize this. And the first way that it did that was through partnerships with fact-checking organizations. So that kind of brings us, I think, to the frame of the original reason why some of the fact-checking programs were created.
I want to add one tiny piece of color, though, which is, Renee, it's not just about the idea that people liked that content and it went viral. It's that Facebook had a variety of features that actively gave those Macedonians an opportunity to succeed. So it used to be when you engaged with a post in any way, you put a comment on it, you put a like on it, a little box would appear right under that post where an AI would say, hey, you liked this story, what other stories can we show you? And the reason why things like Pope endorses Donald Trump went so viral was someone put a like on a post about Donald Trump and they looked through all the other possible posts and they said, what gets the most engagement? Oh, the Pope endorsing Donald Trump. And so that story then got shown to everyone who in any way showed a preference for Donald Trump. And after 2016, they took a step back and said, where were we responsible, like our choices for how we design these products? And fact-checking was one of the things that they did in that kind of response.
So, Frances, you're saying that me, as a user, I didn't have to go seek out that information. That information came to me.
Yes.
Interesting. So you joined Facebook to work on its civic integrity team right around this time that Renee has described. What was the focus of that team's work, and were they successful at it, at least initially?
So what's so intriguing about the news of this week and like the work that I did was, people hear things like civic misinformation and their minds immediately jump to things like Hunter Biden laptop. Our team was meant to be a complement to the third-party fact-checking team, because the third-party fact-checking team only touched maybe a couple hundred stories each month in the United States. Like, this wasn't a thing that could handle the volume of content that was created on Facebook. And they knew there was a blind spot, which was places like Myanmar didn't have any fact-checking. So our job was to look at the design of the product. And as a data scientist, as a product manager, I'm one of those few people that wears both hats. We looked across the product and at the algorithms and said, what are ways that we could change these things such that we could make it less likely that things like Pope endorses Donald Trump become one of the top 20 sites. And what's interesting is I only got to do that work, focusing on places like Myanmar, places that were at risk for genocide, for about 3 months before Facebook discovered a foreign interference operation from Russia that was targeting police officers. And they said, oh, we have this problem. We've only been thinking about viral misinformation, like stuff that everyone sees. It actually matters if someone sends targeted misinformation. And so that was the second big thing I worked on at Facebook.
So, Renee, you do a lot of work around these particular topics, the state or government-run information warfare, as well as misinformation. But pseudoscience is another big piece of this. And I can't help but think of COVID and the way that misinformation spread on the internet during that season as well. What did moderation look like during that time? And, what did it look like behind the scenes as folks were trying to mitigate the sort of fake news, misinformation? And what was the forward-facing result? Like, what would I as a user notice?
So a lot of the health misinformation moderation work started long prior to COVID, and that's because there were measles outbreaks in Brooklyn and in Samoa. And in the outbreak in Samoa, about 84 children died under the age of 5. And there was a push by the government to implement a mandatory vaccination program in response to that state of emergency. And American anti-vaccine activists tried to undermine that. And so you began to see Meta and others beginning to realize that the growth of the anti-vaccine movement on its platform more broadly was having some very serious repercussions. Prior to that, there had been isolated instances in which misinformation in anti-vaccine groups led to the deaths of American children. That was sporadic, one or two, sadly. Very, very tragic stories. NBC did some great reporting on that, Brandy Zadrozny. And the platform was struggling with this question of, in this particular case, we know the facts about MMR, right? We know it's a safe and effective vaccine. And so the platform began both to post content, trying to surface good information about the vaccine. And this was around the time when a framework that Isa Raskin and I called freedom of speech, not freedom of reach, began to be a way that we could think about this, which was to say, anti-vaccine groups could stay on the platform, but the content didn't need to be, as Frances is describing, pushed out proactively to users. Meaning if you wanted to go join an anti-vaccine group, that was there, it was available to you. But the platform was not going to recommend it. It was not going to allow anti-vaccine groups to run ads targeting people with bad information about vaccines, right? And that was the sort of operating principle that had grown up on the platform before COVID. Now, what happened with COVID was a very, very interesting situation, which is that there was not a lot of authoritative sources that actually had accurate information immediately at the time in which people wanted it. And what I mean by that is the CDC, HHS, the various health agencies, WHO, Singaporean health authorities, you name it. There are a bunch of these kind of big authorities that are very good at learning the facts, but it takes some time to get the facts, and people want information before that. So Facebook found itself struggling with a situation where misleading claims made by anybody, because, we can all speak on social media, and that's one of the real values. But again, this question of what do you serve to people? What do you push out? What do you amplify? What do you highlight? How do you, when something that is wrong or misleading goes viral, how do you correct it? This was where things like the labeling efforts took place. A lot of what Meta did during COVID was it throttled content that it, was trying to wait to see if it was true or not, or was not 100% sure of whether it was good to amplify or not. And then in some cases, it removed content. And For a while, that was largely limited to things like fake cures. But one of the things that you see happen here is as governments and leaders apply some pressure and say, hey, you really need to be doing more, right? You see the Biden administration's comments on this. You see the Trump administration was in power, of course, when COVID began. The way in which government engages is to say, like, hey, we need to be in touch with you so that you're doing your best to amplify good information, and we're occasionally going to tell you when something is bad. And that does lead occasionally to scope creep around what kinds of content the platform chooses to target, right? And so you do start to see things like the lab leak hypothesis, right? The theories about where COVID origins come from. That was around March of 2020, I think. There was an article that was stifled, that was prevented for, distribution was diminished. Again, that was during the Trump administration, but this was described, now in the public mindset after a few years after COVID, this has all been recast as some sort of vast, Biden-era censorship regime. And so there's been, now you're seeing a political blowback in the other direction in which, again, some of the policies weren't great. Some of the enforcement was ad hoc. Some of it was just, it's a very chaotic time and they made some bad decisions. But a lot of this is being recast now as some sort of politically motivated effort to silence people that Zuckerberg is now reframing himself, even though he was in charge then too, of those policies. Now he's reframing himself as the hero who's restoring the old policies. So we're sort of reverting back to a more 2015 type, environment.
And what's funny is, like, I was on the area of the company that was meant to help Facebook be a more positive impact on the world. And people were talking about, like, remember, there were rumors about COVID as early as January of 2020. And when I talked to people, the thing that people were most worried about was vaccine misinformation. And when we look at the documents that studied how this misinformation spread on Facebook, one of the pieces of infrastructure that my team built in order to try to find targeted misinformation was we divided up all the users on Facebook into little communities. We said, who are your friends? What content do you consume? What groups do you join? What pages do you join? Let's look at that all together. Let's make consistent communities. We're not going to label them. We're not going to put a label on you. We're not going to say, you're a middle-aged woman who lives in Tennessee. Like, we're not going to do that. We're just going to say, based on other people like you, let's put you in clumps. And what they found was that 80% of the COVID misinformation went to communities that made up 4% of the United States. So when you think about people showing up at school board meetings with, like, screaming at people, when you think about people showing up at teachers' homes screaming about masks, it's because a very small fraction of the United States got completely bombarded with COVID misinformation. And part of that is about design choices. It's not about saying, like, people sought out X, Y, or Z. It's about, like, for example, if you say a post that gets a new comment is a new piece of content, and you can go back to the top of your feed again. You saw things like moms in groups that were vaccine skeptical saying things like, hey, one of my kids has cancer. I'm thinking about vaccinating my other kids. And they get 200 comments piling on talking about how dangerous this was. And every time that post could go back to the top of someone's feed. So this isn't just about people's content preferences or, like, the information they want to get. It's about design choices that the platforms are making and optimized to make them the most money.
Listen to the full episode wherever podcasts are found.